Bonsoir, good evening. Welcome to the French Institute. I'm Jérôme Chevrier. I work for the French Institute. I'm in charge of books and ideas. We are really delighted to welcome you at the French Institute, especially in this beautiful library that you might know. Just a few words about the French Institute. So I don't know if you are all members of the French Institute. If you are not yet, please register. At the French Institute, we have obviously this library for fiction, non-fiction, comics, video, everything. We do have a big program of cinema and many festivals. And we do a lot of events. So you have the highlights for the first trimester. And this first period of the year, we do a specific events about Versailles in connection with the exhibition at the Science Museum. And we do have for you a beautiful workshop for dance and perfume. And yes, so that's it. That's it. So have a good evening, and maybe we can talk a little bit later. Thank you.
Good evening, bienvenue, welcome to the Institute, and thank you very much indeed to the Institute for once again hosting our Douglas Johnson lecture. I'm Penny Roberts. I'm currently president of the Society for the Study of French History, which organises this event along with the Association for the Society of Modern and Contemporary France. We established this lecture in honour of Douglas Johnson because he was indeed, I think, the first president of the ASMCF and also very much a friend of the SSFH as well. Served for many years in the department at UCL and indeed in Birmingham, and as is mentioned, I think in the Wikipedia entry, an apologetically francophile seems an appropriate person to have this lecture dedicated to him, and we have in the past very much welcomed members of his family and others who knew Douglas back in the day. And so this is the 15th, in fact, lecture of the Douglas Johnson series. And we're very much looking forward to Hanna Diamond, who is going to say, I think, a few more words about Douglas as well before she begins her lecture. So I am going to just deal with a little bit of society business because this does give us an opportunity to make announcements of the first of our first book prizes, so that we have an award of a first book prize, and just to announce that, it was awarded to Lewis Wade, who's at the University of Leiden, for his book on Privilege, Economy and State in Old Regime France, Marine Insurance, War and the Atlantic Empire under Louis XIV. So many congratulations to him. There were a number of runners-up as well who were very much very high quality of submissions for that first book prize, which is a new initiative by the Society. So we obviously want to encourage early scholars, early career scholars in their pursuit of French history, and that's very much the métier, the raison d'être of our societies. So I just wanted to make that announcement here. But now I shall hand over to Ludivine Broch, who is our events officer, who organises all these events and makes sure they run smoothly, and she's going to be introducing our speaker this evening. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I am delighted to be welcoming so many familiar faces and new faces to this evening tonight. The room is packed, the event was booked out, and this is a huge testament to our speaker, Professor Hanna Diamond, who I think for many of us requires no introduction. But I do want to highlight her huge contribution to the field of French history and the field of Second World War studies, because that's what the speakers at the Douglas Johnson Memorial Lectures are selected because they've made such a great contribution. And Hanna Diamond is therefore Professor of French History in the School of Modern Languages at Cardiff University. And when I first came across her, it was through her first works, which were on women in the Second World War in France, which was in 1999, and her work on fleeing Hitler, France 1940. And both of those works, which were really impactful on my own discovery of the history of France in the Second World War, I think the themes there are going to be really evident tonight, of gender, her interest in gender history and gender studies, but also in personal stories of individuals, which has always been this very granular history, which she's always been so wonderful and skilled at conveying, and so interested in. And Hanna Diamond's work has also been more encompassing of a wider audience, and I think that's very distinctive in her approach. She collaborates with a number of non-academic partners in the creative industries, TV, film, theater, and also in the cultural sector in the UK and France, like the Musée de la Libération in Paris, which you played a very big role in. And I have to say, I met two teenagers a few months ago, unprompted, I don't think they even knew I was a historian, who said they'd been to this amazing museum in Paris, which was the Musée de la Libération. And I think if it comes from teenagers, then it's safe to say it's very cool. Now, tonight, these personal stories, this interest in gender history, this interest in telling stories to a wider audiences is all going to come out with the theme of Josephine Baker. Now, from 2021 to 2023, Hanna had a Leverhulme Research Fellowship, which allowed her to carry out the work for this book. And the book, Josephine Baker's Secret War, you all have little flyers on your seats, which are about the book, which is coming out in April. And so we're so delighted. It's coming out with Yale University Press. And we're so delighted to be able to have this lecture, a sneak preview. It's very under wraps, but we are getting the sneak preview of Josephine Baker's War. And I was just talking to Hanna about having read her memoir a few years ago for a class I was teaching, and about how complicated it was to use as a historian. So I think we're going to get many insights on this very important topic, and I will now be quiet, sit down, and let Hanna do the speaking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ludovine, and you'll all have to forgive me. I hope to be able to get through this evening's lecture without coughing, but I am at the end of a really nasty bug, so please bear with me. So thank you, Ludovine, for your wonderful invitation on behalf of the Society for the Study of French History and my friends at the Association for the Study of Modern Contemporary France, and of course, the Institut Français, this wonderful collaboration that this is this lecture. And of course, as Ludovine has said, it's a wonderful opportunity for me to give my Josephine Baker research a first airing before the book appears in April. I have talked quite a lot about Josephine Baker, actually, but in France. This is my first showing of the research I've done in the UK, so very much a premiere, as it were. And what I'm hoping to do tonight is give you a taste of the research in the book. It's also a great privilege for me to have the opportunity to talk today at this lecture in honor of Douglas Johnson, who died in 2005. My main memory of Douglas, and I did meet him, but I was a very young postgraduate student at the time, was a memory of hearing about him through my mentor, Rod Kedward. And they did talk a lot. They would have a lot of debates and discussions, mainly centered on de Gaulle, of course. Rod even references some of these debates in his last book. the French resistance and its legacy. Douglas heard de Gaulle's appel and was an ardent Gaullist. And this actually is something, surprisingly, that he shares with Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker was also very keen on de Gaulle. And in fact, so much so that when she finally had the opportunity to meet with General de Gaulle and Yvonne de Gaulle in July 1943 at a benefit concert, if I can make this work, yes, was called by Yvonne de Gaulle as a sale petite Gaulliste. And Josephine Baker was so taken with this title that she used to use it to sign her letters to de Gaulle, as you can see here. And she did write to de Gaulle a lot in the post-war period. She would send him telegrams every 18th of June, marking the day of the appel. And you can see here, this is a letter from the 23rd of January 1958, and she says, "Je reste votre fidèle sale Gaulliste." Now, I've translated this as a kind of naughty little Gaulliste. It was a kind of teasing term. But it gives us a sense of really that devotion and dedication that she had for de Gaulle. And she proved to be really a remarkably effective promoter of the Gaullist cause, as I hope to demonstrate today. So how did I become interested in Josephine Baker? My initial interactions with Josephine Baker and the war period came about when I was commissioned to do some research, actually, into Josephine Baker and to write a long-form article reconstructing her wartime life, really just the first 3 years of her experiences during the war. And I was amazed to find, while I was doing this research, the paucity of information about her, the paucity of scholarly work about her life during this period. Scholars like Bernetta Jules Rosette have written brilliantly about Josephine Baker's extraordinary rise to fame after her arrival in Paris in 1925, and her performance of the Danse Sauvage, which both thrilled and shocked the French public. She charts Baker's evolving dance style and her transition to becoming a singer as her music hall career developed throughout the late 20s and 30s. Elizabeth Ezra and Terry Simone Francis have focused on the importance of Baker's films, because she did do a number of films in the 30s. They highlight the significance of the pastiche, or the colonial personas that she would play as her music hall developed. And Matthew Guthrell, here this is actually Josephine Baker and the Rainbow Tribe, is a wonderful book, which I don't think is terribly well known in this country. He offers us a really insightful view of her remarkable post-war experiment in multicultural life, the establishment of her Rainbow Tribe at her chateau in Dordogne, when she adopted a number of children from across the globe, allocated them different identities and religions in an effort to show the world that people could live peacefully together. And it was an experiment that ultimately failed, but it was a very interesting one. But I found no serious study in French or in English of her wartime experiences and contributions. So I felt somewhat impelled to see what I could find out. Now, there are a number of sources, and this is a very key source. This is Jacques Abte's La Guerre Secrète de Josephine Baker. And it really is the most detailed source to recount Baker's activities throughout this period. As you can see, it's published with a letter from de Gaulle as a preface. This letter actually gives the book an appearance of authenticity, but it is somewhat misleading, although I think the Gaullists would thoroughly approve of this account. The letter itself is actually a copy of the handwritten letter that de Gaulle wrote to Baker to congratulate her when she was awarded the Resistance Medal in 1946. So it's not directly linked to the account, although it certainly does give us a sense of the value that de Gaulle himself felt that her work had represented. Now, Jacques Abté was head of military counterintelligence, the Deuxième Bureau, in Paris from around 1936. 1936 he was appointed. And it was he who recruited Baker in autumn 1939, and he was responsible for training her to collect and transmit intelligence and became her handler. So he's a very key figure in Josephine Baker's war, if you like. And they worked up together up until the middle of 1944, although they stayed in touch subsequently. There are also a number of autobiographical texts. Ludovine's talked about the memoir that Josephine Baker wrote in collaboration with Marcel Sauvage from about, well, really from 1925 onwards, which I believe are being translated quite soon and published by Penguin. They are difficult texts for us as historians because they have to be treated with caution. Baker had quite a penchant for embellishment, frequently contradicted herself, and even indulged in a bit of invention. So these memoirs were very much written with an eye to her public persona. She had a way of wanting to project the image that she thought people would like to hear and know about her. Similarly, there's a collections of writings by and about Baker that were published by her then husband, Joe Bouillon, very soon after her death. And although these texts have value, they are not, I guess, always going to give us. They give us insights, we can hear her voice, but they're not necessarily all that accurate in terms of the history. But anyway, using these texts as a baseline, with the support of the Leverhulme Trust, as Ludovine was saying, I set out on a path to find more, determined to uncover what I could in a variety of French, American, and British archives as I sought to chart Josephine Baker's wartime movements. She went from France to Morocco in 1941, where she was based in Casablanca and actually in Marrakesh. Josephine Baker preferred Marrakesh, which she saw as a much more interesting city than the big, rather cold port of Casablanca. And she did troop tours around North Africa and across the Middle East, coming back to France in October 1944. On her return to Europe, she followed the French First Army, giving benefit concerts in Germany and Italy, also visiting England in late April, May 1945. In fact, she was here just before and just after VE Day, giving concerts in a series of factories and hospitals, as we'll see. So today, I want to focus on three key aspects of the research I've uncovered. Firstly, I want to say something about Baker and her work as an intelligence agent under cover of her celebrity. Of course, she's not at all the profile of a spy who blends in and passes unnoticed. She was both a huge star and a woman of colour. So how did she become such an effective spy? Jacques Abté, as we've seen, was her handler. So who did this couple work for? What intelligence were they involved in collecting? And in addressing these questions, I think it's really important to distinguish two key phases in their work. A first phase, which runs up to November 1942 and the Allied invasion of North Africa. Most accounts that do deal with Baker and her intelligence work tend to focus mainly on this first phase, Baker's work for the Allies before November 1942. But Baker actually carried on working as an operative into a second phase, this time working directly for de Gaulle's chief of staff in 1943 and 1944. And I think to overlook this period is to miss a significant part of her wartime service and achievements. And I hope one of the key contributions of my book will be to draw attention to this important period of her wartime work. Secondly, I'd like to say something about how the war was an opportunity for Baker not to demonstrate not just her commitment to her French citizenship, which it certainly was, but also to show what I've called a kind of apprenticeship in civil rights. Baker was motivated by her love of France, there's no doubt about that. She had a kind of visceral patriotism. She hated the Nazis, their racism and anti-Semitism, and she had a huge support for the Allies. She was American. She talks a lot about the Americans will come, the Americans will save France. And she had, as we've seen, this deep personal commitment to de Gaulle. In addition, though, I would like to argue that she came to see how she could use her position as a platform to promote the African-American servicemen. She met in ways, again, I would argue, that foreshadowed her later activism in the civil rights movement. And we saw earlier that she brought this multicultural family together, but she did also go out on the roads and campaign in favor of civil rights. Thirdly, I want to finish by talking a little bit more in a way that is linked about her unique transnational identity, which allowed her to adopt an overt propaganda role alongside her clandestine activities. Her status both as French and American allowed Baker to reach across cultures and build bridges at times when misunderstandings were rife, and she was able to operate as a remarkably effective propaganda figure to promote the Gaullist cause. And as we will see, Baker's celebrity was central to each of these aspects and made all her activities possible. So, Baker and her work as an intelligence agent. What made Baker such a good spy? Despite Abdey's initial reticence, and it's true that he wasn't at all sure that she was going to make a good spy when he first met her, he'd heard about Josephine Baker. She was this big star. She didn't at all fit the idea that he had of what a spy should be doing. He was also, I think, as were most of the French Secret Service at the time, somewhat bruised by their experiences of the First World War and the problems they'd had with Mata Hari. But unlike him, she did prove to be a remarkably able operative. She passed unsuspected, really, for the whole of the war. Her performing, her fundraising work, and troop entertainment all provided her with very solid cover. For information gathering, this was often related to the people and the circles she could access. For example, in late 1939, while still in Paris, she was able to contrive invitations to embassies, and she would discuss with unsuspecting diplomatic officials who, allegedly starstruck, would say much more than they should have. And she reported back to Abdey information from contacts at the Italian and Japanese embassies that he found very useful. Once they were established in Morocco in 1941, Baker was able to develop valuable friendships with local elites there, including the powerful Pasha of Marrakesh, Tami El Galawi. A colourful figure, he was known as the second Sultan of Morocco, and he was very taken with Baker, and he and his circle of notables took her into their fold. Contacts like these enabled Baker to be in the know. She could pick up information easily. For example, she became aware of the different operatives, the different offices operating. She became aware of the different spy networks that were operating in the covert landscape that was Morocco during the 1941 to 42. German and Italian agents of the Armistice Commission and so on. She was well placed and had a good network of contacts. She was also very well placed for the transfer of information, and this was related to her ability to move around freely. She could get permissions and visas that others could not. An example of one of her missions helps to make this point. In November 1940, Baker, travelling with Abte as her secretary with a false identity, made their way to Lisbon. When they crossed through the border from France to Spain, the border guards were so distracted by Baker, by her star power, allegedly the border guards all went rushing off to fetch their wives and come, Josephine Baker's at the border, we have to try and get her autograph and so on, that Abte was able to slip through with a load of secret intelligence on his person, without everyone noticing. Allegedly, he was carrying intelligence on the German presence in occupied France, written in code, in invisible ink, on her song sheets. Though this part of the story may be more down to the influences of spy fiction than a true representation of happened, I have to say, I never saw a document that actually put this down in chapter and verse. Nonetheless, we can see how crucial Baker's celebrity was in facilitating her own movements, her ability to travel, and facilitating the movement of others, notably Abte. So who did they work for? And this is where it gets a bit more complicated. For this first period, there's no disputing that in 1941 to 42, until the Allied invasion of North Africa, Baker and Abte worked to advance the Allied cause. But despite their own frequent pronouncements that they were free French combatants, the actual mechanics of their allegiances emerged from the sources as being somewhat murky. And I'm sure those of us who are familiar with North Africa during this period won't find that altogether surprising. Significantly, both Baker and Abte date their affiliation as Free French combatants from November 1940, when they managed first to get to Lisbon and make contact with British intelligence. And they made this trip under the aegis of the Deuxième Bureau. Yes, the Deuxième Bureau that Abte had been heading up before the war and right up until the fall of France. And its head, Paul Payol, Abte's former superior, reconvened this Deuxième Bureau in the summer of 1940. This counterintelligence network was originally disbanded with the fall of France and fell into disarray during the defeat and the exodus as everyone fled the German invasion. But Article 4 of the Armistice Agreement that Vichy signed with the Germans in June 1940 allowed for the existence of a small French army stationed in the unoccupied zone and across France's colonial empire. This was used as the basis for Payol to reconvene the Deuxième Bureau and for military counterintelligence to pursue its anti-German espionage. And Simon Kitson has done a lot of work to show how these Vichy organizations did carry on pursuing German Nazi spies. Now, certain of these activities were, Payol claims, overt and known to Vichy, while at the same time, he also developed a clandestine operation under cover of a Société des Travaux Ruraux, of which he was the director, based in Marseille. And this cover allowed him to place agents across the country as rural works engineers, or TR, and to continue to gather and transmit intelligence. And it was this intelligence on what was going on in occupied France in 1941, that Baker and Abte were able to take and give to the British in Lisbon when they arrived, wanting British help to get them to join de Gaulle, because both Abte and Baker were determined that they wanted to get to London and join de Gaulle. The British, however, assured them that their contribution had been logged and registered with the Gaullist community in London, but suggested that their contribution would be much more useful if they were to relocate to Casablanca in French Morocco. Yes, that hotbed of espionage that we all know so well from the film. The British plan was for Baker and Abte to be based at the heart of a network relaying to Britain via North Africa intelligence collected by Payol's agents in occupied France and North Africa. It's a complicated and unclear picture. Abte's claims that he was a Free French combatant from June 1940 were later disputed by the military authorities in the post-war exchanges in his files. He did a lot of work to try and persuade the military that he had been an active Free French fighter really from June 1940 onwards. He did finally manage to persuade them, but these exchanges do leave a certain sense in which there is not clarity about their position. The reality is that although in moving to Casablanca they were following up on the British request, they were still working under cover of the 2e Bureau, which was at that time a Vichy-affiliated organisation and was seen by the British as such, and of course would have been seen as such by the Gaullists in London as well. To further complicate things, once Baker and Abte moved to North Africa, Abte very quickly fell under suspicion. He had, after all, been a counterintelligence agent in Paris for years, and he wasn't able to get the necessary visas to travel, so Baker was compelled to act alone. And as we've seen she could get those visas, she could make the case, I need to go to Lisbon to do a performance, I need to go to Spain, and she also was able to make the case that she was planning tours in South America and so on. So she ended up traveling alone. She made trips to Lisbon and Spain under cover of these performances. On one of these trips, she even appears to have been traveling without the knowledge at all of Payol or his officers. In April 1941, Baker undertook an intelligence gathering mission to see if the Germans were preparing for an invasion of Morocco in concert with the Spanish. The Allies were perpetually terrified that Hitler would team up with Franco and that Morocco would be invaded. Abte and Baker got wind of this from some of their Moroccan friends, that perhaps there'd been troop movements on the border, so Baker headed off on her own. And the trip was thankfully successful, but it was a dangerous gamble for them. And it shows that Abte took some risks with Baker and sometimes seemed to have acted on his own initiative, leading Baker out on a limb to work in something of a vacuum. And he certainly comes across in the source material as something of a chancer, a bit of a wheeler-dealer. He wasn't entirely trusted by the Gaullists, and it's interesting because although he falls under suspicion by authorities, protectorate authorities in North Africa, Baker's patriotic credentials are never under question. There are intelligence reports which see her as being watertight despite her association with him. So she's not seen at all in the same way as him. Now, in July 1941, Baker fell dangerously ill and her activities came to an abrupt end as she fought for her life in a clinic in Casablanca. She was completely out of action for many months, but thankfully did recover. While she was unwell, the Americans arrived in North Africa. Under cover of a Franco-American trade agreement signed in March 1941, operatives known as vice consuls were placed across the region to ensure that its terms were fulfilled. In reality, these men were intelligence agents, a part of the Office of Strategic Services, an early form of the CIA, with a mission to inform on conditions in North Africa. Abte alleges that through his contacts at the Deuxième Bureau, he was put in touch with the vice consuls who were placed in Casablanca and started passing on intelligence directly to them with the agreement of the British. And as plans were laid for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, Baker's room at the clinic where she was convalescing became a convenient place of rendezvous for the Americans to get news of the star who was on her recovering star, but also to be introduced to Baker's well-positioned Moroccan friends, as well as French officers they knew to be sympathetic to the cause of resistance. Now, disappointingly, despite reading everything I could find in the OSS archives that even mentioned French Morocco, although I did find evidence that the vice consuls did work with agents of the Deuxième Bureau, I found no meeting of these wonderfully romantic meetings in Baker's clinic. Was this perhaps because the Americans never named their informants? They were really careful about that. They would annotate the reliability of their informants, but they never actually gave chapter and verse about them. On the other hand, I did find evidence that Baker was helpful to the Americans during the invasion. An officer of the Counterintelligence Corps, a certain Lieutenant Paul Jensen, reported on the significant role that Baker had played helping him and his men during the crucial weeks after the landings when the Americans needed to secure Morocco, indicating that Baker had supported their mission, I quote, at great risk to her own life. Baker supplied the names of all the German agents in the area, and drawing on her intimate knowledge of the situation in Marrakesh, under her guidance and with the intelligence she was able to provide, his unit was able to counteract the subversive efforts of the members of the German Armistice Commission in the city. And as a result of his work, Jensen was awarded a Silver Star. So I think we can conclude that even if there are gaps in the archives and in the sources, Baker did play a part in assisting the Americans. Moving into the second phase of her intelligence then, from 1943 to 44, when Baker was working directly for the Gaullists. In the second half of 1943, Baker with Abte, along with other colleagues, undertook a propaganda mission to promote the cause of de Gaulle, while also tasked with collecting intelligence on the growing Arab nationalist movement across the Middle East. And here, my friends at Yale University Press have put together a map for us, which shows us this extraordinary trip she took in jeeps. There were 2 jeeps, and they traveled in jeeps from Marrakesh all the way across North Africa to Cairo, and then up into Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine as it was then. The Gaullists were deeply suspicious about British ambitions in the Middle East and felt that their colonial empire was coming under threat. They were particularly uneasy about developments in the Levant, where, to the frustration of the Foreign Office, General Spears, protected by his friendship with Churchill, was orchestrating trouble with the Arabs to undermine the French. There was also considerable uncertainty in Gaullist circles about whether the Americans might be secretly encouraging Arab nationalists in their calls for independence. So Baker and her companions used troop entertainment as a cover to visit these various destinations across the Middle East and to meet with contacts across a wide range of circles, including, for example, the King Farouk of Egypt, who was keen to meet the great star. So we see again her celebrity coming into play, opening doors. They were able to report to Algiers on the attitudes of those they met and the nature of their allegiances to France. And actually, they were very worried that France was losing influence, and they urged the Comité in Algiers to act. They also worked to promote de Gaulle, both at organised shows and events, but also behind the scenes. In this, they were aided by their well-to-do Moroccan friend, Mohamed Menebi, who was highly respected in Arab circles. Persuaded by Baker and Abte to join the Gaullist cause, his participation was crucial in allowing them to promote their message among influential Arab dignitaries. Okay, then moving on to my second theme, the war as an opportunity for Baker to demonstrate her Frenchness, if you like, and as an apprenticeship in civil rights. In her autobiographical documents, these problematic documents we alluded to earlier, Josephine Baker movingly describes how her wartime service was motivated by her sense of gratitude to the French people who had made her a star. But she was also driven by her hatred of the Nazis and their racism, which she'd experienced firsthand in 1929 on visits to Germany and Austria, when she was really vilified and the Nazis demonstrated, and in Vienna they made every effort to stop her from performing. They didn't succeed, but she understood the danger that she was in. She felt very targeted. Baker became a French citizen on her marriage to Jean Lyon in 1937, and this was a source of great pride to her. Importantly, the union made her keenly aware of the dangers faced by Jews from the Nazis, as Jean Lyon was Jewish. Though the marriage did not last, they were divorced in 1941, she became very fond of the family, became particularly close to her mother-in-law, and she was attracted to Judaism. I was talking actually at an event I did in Paris last year to her son, and he talked about how she started the process of conversion and always carried a Jewish prayer book with her. So she really felt a strong sense of identification with Judaism. Now, along with these motivations, however, I also found that she came to see the war as an opportunity to promote the role being played by African American servicemen in ways she hoped would help their court case for equality. In spring 1943, Baker carried out an extensive camp tour entertaining those American troops who'd been posted and were stationed in North Africa. She was immensely well received by her troop audiences, and her shows brought her face to face with the realities of life for the African American servicemen who'd been relegated to the most unpleasant tasks in the military, working in canteens, doing heavy building work, clearing areas, and they were not allowed on active duty. Baker was therefore once again confronted with the harsh realities of segregation that she'd been so delighted to leave behind on her arrival in France. Before the war, scholars like Tyler Stovall have shown how Baker distanced herself from the African American community which had thrived in Paris between the wars. However, I found that articles in the African American press in 1943 map an increasing willingness on Baker's part to speak out about her race. She commented to one reporter that she was, I quote, "so proud and thrilled at the great advancement that my race is making in this war." In an interview for the Chicago Defender, when asked about her motivations to perform, she was clear. First, I want to do what I can to win the war and thus perform whatever duty I can for my native land. Second, I want to help those of my own race. I'm doing all I can to help win the war effort and to make people generally more appreciative and kinder to my race. Such pronouncements were frequent, although they obviously stopped when she became an officer of the Free French Air Force the following year. But they point to her growing consciousness of the way she could mobilize her platform to promote the causes she believed in. She would use this platform in a similar way when it came to promoting the cause of de Gaulle and the Free French. And this brings me to my third and final section about how Baker was able to mobilize her own transnational identity to become a superb propagandist and a quasi-ambassadorial figure. How are we doing for time, Ludovine? Okay. Baker's stardom and reputation certainly helped to open doors, as we've seen, and this, combined with her national affiliations, both as French and American, as well as the fact that she was a woman of colour, gave her an entree into a whole range of milieux in North Africa and across the Middle East, enabling her to gain acceptance and move in circles and promote the Free French, not just on the stage, but off stage too. Newspaper articles chart the various dinners she attended, the places she visited, as she carried out this important work. Thomas Young, correspondent for the New Journal and Guide, accompanied Baker to a post-performance meal in the palace of a local Moroccan notable. The image that appeared under the headline, I quote, "Officers, Muslims meet at a party for Josephine Baker," shows the beaming star, the only woman seated with 9 men, including both white and African-American officers in uniform, and Moroccos wearing traditional Arab dress. Baker, he recounts, rattled away to everyone at this dinner in French, in English, facilitating, getting everyone to talk to each other. And then, during the after-dinner conversations, she excused herself and went to the adjoining room and chatted with the women who were next door. And I think we see this extraordinary ability she has to move across these different areas of Moroccan society. Her tour in 1943, you saw this extraordinary trip she went on of the Middle East, proved her effectiveness in promoting de Gaulle. And in recognition of this, in the spring of 1944, she was named a second lieutenant propaganda officer of the Auxiliary Corps of the French Air Force. And here we see this publicity picture, which is in her commander, Major Alain Dumanel's office, and this very clear link that's being made with de Gaulle and the Résistance Française, the Croix de Lorraine there. And this was actually also made into a recruitment film to try and encourage in North Africa to get women to sign up and join. This is a later picture actually of a later concert she did once she returned to Paris. But what's of interest here is this enormous flag of the Cross of Lorraine, which Baker had made for her concert tours. And when she was doing her concerts and rousing everyone to talking about de Gaulle and the importance of Gaullism, this great flag would drop down at the culmination of her performances in a kind of crescendo. Here we see an image of her arriving back in France. Sorry, I seem to have knocked this. And you can see her in her uniform, just arrived back in Marseille. Do you recognize her? La reconnaissez-vous? She was a hugely powerful figure because, of course, everyone did recognize her. And she gave a lot of interviews when she reached Paris. This interview here in Défense de la France, which would later become France ce soir, She told everyone about her support for the Free French. Je ne suis qu'un soldat. I'm just a simple soldier. I'm doing my job, promoting France. And she was a familiar figure. We have to remember at this point that de Gaulle was someone people had heard of. He was a voice. But here was this extraordinarily well-known star who was coming out and reassuring the French people, you know, it's okay to support de Gaulle. And in May, June 1945, as I said before, Baker came to London. She came to England. She carried out a series of ad hoc performances in factories, hospitals, and army camps around the country. And her tour culminated in this show in London on the 14th of May. She was introduced actually by Noel Coward. She and Noel Coward had actually met also in North Africa. Noel Coward did a great deal of troupe entertaining work as well. Importantly, Baker was a familiar and reassuring figure, whereas de Gaulle was virtually unknown to the French public. Her link with the Air Force was also valuable at a time when the Air Force was struggling to defend its reputation due to its poor showing during the battles of the campaign of 1939 to 1940. And there's no doubting that Baker's appearances, particularly in North Africa and the Middle East, a woman of colour who'd successfully become such a huge star, made her a powerful symbol of France's apparent tolerance and openness to ethnic diversity, a really important message to communicate in North Africa. But her support for Gaullism also set her against the growing nationalist movements that were developing at that time across North Africa and the Middle East. It was this period, of course, the beginnings of decolonization. In January 1944, the Moroccan nationalist movement Istiqlal published their agenda for independence, placing themselves in opposition to the Gaullist French protectorate authorities. Baker made it clear in her pronouncements that she considered their demands to be premature. Her superior officer, who we saw earlier, Alain Dumanil, would later reveal in her letter she wrote in favour of Baker's candidature for the Légion d'honneur, that Baker's action in Morocco at this time, during the turbulent period of nationalist upheaval at the end of 1943 and in early 1944, had offered powerful support for France at a time when its interests in the country had become very precarious. So she acted very much in favour of the Gaullist protectorate authorities, not supporting these independence movements. In conclusion then, Baker was decommissioned in September 1945, and I would argue that her wartime experience fed her later activism which matured in her participation in the campaign for civil rights and her efforts to raise a multi-ethnic family. In 1946, she was awarded a Resistance Medal, here we see her, from Colonel de Boissoudi, Deputy Chair of the Awarding Committee. This is a civil award, and here we see her actually once again laid up, a similar problem to those very worrying problems she'd experienced during the war, receiving the medal. But despite being put forward for a Légion d'honneur in 1948, she was turned down twice before finally gaining the award in 1958. It seems likely that this was in part linked to the confusion I alluded to around Abte and his allegiances. As we've seen, he was a maverick figure who was not always appreciated by the Gaullists. In addition, Baker was absolutely determined that she should not just be given a civil Légion d'honneur, applauding her for troupe entertainment and propaganda. She wanted to have a military award as well. It appears to have taken a while to sway the military hierarchy of the value of her intelligence work, despite some very strongly worded letters of support from her superior officers. Finally, Jacques Chaban-Delmas, who was Minister of the Army at the time, managed to swing the committee in her favour, and she was awarded the Légion d'honneur and also the Croix de Guerre for her military contribution. The formal award ceremony, you can see it taking place here in 1961 at her chateau, and she did rather orchestrate the occasion to promote her now struggling Rainbow tribe, the family. She ran into financial problems, and she used this. There was a lot of publicity to try and generate public support for that project. The same year, Baker took part in the March in Washington, dressed in her Air Force uniform, sporting all these medals. I would argue we can draw a direct link from her commitment to civil rights back to her wartime service. In November 2021, Josephine Baker's life was celebrated by the symbolic transfer of her ashes to the Pantheon. At this time, I happened to be around in France, just starting out on this project, and was frequently contacted by journalists and historians interested in this period of her life that seemed to be arriving as something quite new that people actually didn't know a great deal about. Unfortunately, I was still only at the beginning of my research at that time, but although some shadows still remain, I hope I've given you a taste of how my research will improve our understanding of this extraordinary, multifaceted figure who, during the war, did great service for the Allies and her country. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was absolutely brilliant. And I think, I was too enthralled to even look at the time, but we're perfectly on time. And I think now's a good time to start thinking about your questions. We've got about 20, 30 minutes before we'll go into drinks in the next room. But I was thinking that since I'm chairing, I get a privilege of asking a first question. And then we'll be able to send the mic around the room, I think, to hear your questions. I mean, the picture that you show of Josephine is I mean, it's so interesting and so rich. I mean, everything that she did, and when you see her lying in the bed getting, the medal, it's very. You see the extent to which, I mean, she physically and politically was engaged in this period of the Second World War with the Allies and the Free French. And I guess I'm wondering about whether there's a slightly different image of her that's a little less glorious. And I'm thinking of two things specifically. I think, do you still have your clicker? Yes. Oh, sorry. There's this one photograph that you show. It's this one. And I think there's another one that follows it, where Josephine Baker is making a really silly face, and she's kind of laughing, and her face is distorted. And if you know a little bit about Josephine Baker and her performances, she's actually is an extremely physical performer and comical. And I was wondering if that. And I think that the humor with the sale Gaullist, yours fondly, sale Gaullist, that she says in her letter, really points to a really funny character and a bit of humor. And so it's slightly, different to this kind of glory, military achievement that we're seeing. And I wonder if you came across more examples of that, the comedian in her, and which is such a useful mask. And the other question I had, which is a little bit more about her post-war life with her Rainbow tribe, but also speaks to maybe her performance as, you know, and her performance here was leading really so much of what she's doing as an intelligence agent and allowing herself and those around her to get access to information, but at the expense of what? And at the expense of whom? And I think, for instance, her Rainbow Tribe, which is a wonderful experiment, but is also the adoption of children from a number of countries around the world. And there's a slight sign of exploitation or something a bit more complicated around that. And I was wondering maybe about those sides of her and how you see them, how you've seen them come across in the archives.
Thank you, Ludovine. As usual, wonderful questions. Okay, taking her humorous side. And I think her humor does come through really strongly. I mean, in her performances, I think that the troupe performances she did and the accounts of those troupe performances, we can see how very effectively she was able to bond with the servicemen, French servicemen, but also American and British servicemen. I mean, she did struggle with racism too. I mean, it's very clear in the archives that racist comments were made, and she became very upset about those, understandably. But she did also clown around on stage. There was a rumor that went round in 1942 that she'd been so terribly ill that she'd actually died, and there were a number of obituaries that went out. In France, they went out, they were quite quickly denied, but in America, they did take some purchase, and after the war, when people met Josephine Baker, oh, you're actually alive. We heard that you weren't. And she used to say to the troops, here I am, I'm not dead, I'm very much alive. And she didn't take herself seriously. But she had this very serious side to her too, like the accounts also say that she had this kind of anthem that she sang, J'ai deux amours, which, you know, she made such a huge hit between the wars. And she would sing this during her troupe performances, and people describe it as being something like a prayer. It was a kind of prayer to France and to Paris. So she had this really multifaceted side. And then your question about, the Rainbow Tribe. It's a tricky one, isn't it? So much came out during the pantheonization ceremonies about her inadequacies as perhaps as a parent, and her lack of understanding about the children's needs. I think c'était parti d'un bon sentiment. You know, she wanted to do something that would be meaningful, but she kind of lost her sense of reality, I think, about that project. And I think it did go really quite horribly wrong, I think. Although, when you talk to the children, and I have had the opportunity, as I said earlier, to meet her son, Brian, who's a kind of spokesman for the others, they do talk about her very positively. But, you know, Brian's quite interesting because since pantheonization, he says he's kind of made a career out of being Josephine Baker's son. He's invited here, there, and everywhere. So there's a kind of double-edged side to that as well, isn't there?
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions on the floor? Yes, I will come round.
Oh, hi. That was a fascinating talk. You mentioned that Josephine Baker sort of essentially came out as a Gaullist in 1941. So presumably before then, she had to pretend to be a supporter, or at least to acquiesce with the government of Vichy France. Did she do that with any success? And how did she actually come out? Did she make a public statement? And how was she then treated by the Vichy government?
She didn't. I mean, from 1940 to 1941, From 1940 to 1941, when she went to Lisbon, she was in her chateau. She went, during the Exode, she went to her chateau, and she was joined there by Abte, who I think realised that Josephine Baker could give him the means to get to London, which was his ambition. And she does say in her memoirs that she heard de Gaulle's appel and that she was immediately drawn to de Gaulle. So she never talks about having supported Vichy at all. But it's difficult to believe that she necessarily would have heard. I mean, there were reasons why Abte, he was part of the military establishment. He retreated with the rest of the French secret services. He was decommissioned in Toulouse. There were reasons and structures why he would have heard de Gaulle's appel. It's less likely to me that Josephine Baker would have heard it. But she says in her memoirs that she was supportive of de Gaulle as soon as she did hear about it, and as soon as Abte talks about it, she leapt on the idea. So she was, to all intents and purposes, in her memoirs, a Gaullist. But I can neither prove nor disprove that, unfortunately.
How much, if at all, did her American status assist her work?
Well, I think it assisted her work a good deal because it gave her an entree as an American, as an African American. She was very well considered. She was invited to parties. As soon as the Americans were in Morocco, they made a bit of a beeline for her, and she certainly was able to facilitate introductions to people locally. I think Patton and Eisenhower's son-in-law, they were all part of that circle of people who interacted with her. And the Moroccan notables that she knew around the Pasha of Morocco, they had money, and they would throw these huge parties that were very much sought after by the American officers. They very much wanted to attend them. They found them very exotic. There would be wonderful food, dancing girls, and all sorts. So I think this transnational identity was absolutely key to the contact she was able to make. And I think the way in which she tapped into both French and American culture, to me, seems incredibly important part of both her intelligence and propaganda work, as I was saying. Yes.
Hello, it's lovely to hear about Josephine Baker and to kind of see the result of your work so far. It's amazing. I was wanting to know about her memoirs and how, maybe you could say something about how you try and respect her words and what she said, but also try and say, oh, actually, yeah, that's not factually accurate. Yeah.
Okay, well, what I've tried to do, and Emily, it's lovely to see you here tonight. What I tried to do is I did take the memoirs as a kind of starting point, and I have used the memoirs in the book because it was important to me that we should hear her voice. But where I could, I've cross-checked it with the sources I could find. Now, as I've explained, I didn't always find the sources I'd like to have found that gave me chapter and verse. I mean, we are working with intelligence, and I think the other thing to be said is Josephine Baker was transferring intelligence. She didn't necessarily always know what was the content. It was written in code. We're told it was in invisible ink. She did what she was told. She followed Abte. He was her handler. So I think a lot of the pronouncements that are in the memoirs, we can take them for what they are, but we also know that if we can't back them up with archival information, we can't actually know that they're a true representation of what happened. What is very interesting is that when Josephine Baker did finally get her Légion d'honneur, the citation follows very closely the pattern of activities that Abte describes in his book. Now, whether that's because there was a gap in the documentation and the archives, or because it's actually what happened, it's simply impossible for me to say. But what I've tried to do is use the memoirs and sort of cross-reference them with the archives that I found.
Thank you very much. That's fabulously interesting. Thank you very, very much indeed. I learned so much about a wonderful person. What I didn't sort of get a sense of, and I'm quite willing to believe that it's not in the archive, but I got very little sense of her inner life. I mean, she's sort of living a life of incredible risk. She could be arrested as a spy. She would be facing the firing squad. I mean, how does she deal with that? Is she sort of somewhat one of these people who's totally impervious to risk? Does she think the US president's going to bail her out? Does she hit the bottle? Does she have serial love affairs? I mean, how does that work? How does she work as a person in this extraordinary career? And also, how does she feel about race? I mean, because, okay, the Nazis have a pretty bad view of race. We all know that. French aren't completely 100% pure on that, as you sort of suggest as well. So sort of, as I say, you're not going to have it in the archive, but what do you think? How does she do it?
I think one of the reasons she's such an effective spy is she does hide herself very deep. Yeah. She has layers upon layers. She's a performer. And I think her espionage activities were a performance. And some of the scholars who have worked much and who are much better versed in the kind of cultural studies side of Josephine Baker and who she was and how she danced and how she performed have talked very interestingly about the various layers of which she operated and the ways for example, the way in which she taps into the colonial unconscious. She was very savvy in the fabrication of her memoirs. She understood, I think she was helped in the early years, certainly, but she understood about how to create a public persona. And in that sense, I think she was... Actually, I thought of her as being the very pursed, real celebrity. You see these pictures of her walking down the Champs-Élysées with a leopard as a publicity stunt. But then I went to the Sarah Bernhardt exhibition at the Petit Palais last year, and I thought, no, Sarah Bernhardt was the first celebrity. But there is something about Josephine Baker who she understood celebrity. She understood about how to project yourself in a public way, and she kept her own private life very private. And she did. I mean, she and Abte there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that they were romantically involved. And she was solicited. I'm sure that Tami El-Galawi, the Pasha Morocco, solicited her. I'm sure that she was hugely sought after. But I think it's very difficult to get to the heart of the kind of Josephine Baker that you're looking for. I did see some film of her on one of the trips she went to Lisbon. She appeared in the Portuguese newsreel of the time, and she does look there rather wistful. And there's an image of her standing on her own in the airport, and I did think then, yeah, it's not all fun and games. She does look a little lonely and frightened. And, I do think Abte project her into situations that were hugely dangerous, and there was a high degree of risk. I mean, but she does seem to have taken on board these risks quite willingly. And she relished being what she saw herself as being a soldier. She relished the troop entertainment. She She wanted to make a contribution. And I think that was a very genuine side to her, which plays out later. And we see how important that war period was, from the way in which she wore the uniform for the March on Washington and so on. But she never really talked about it a great deal. She just said, like actually many of the women in the resistance that I met when I was doing my original postgraduate research, c'était normal. J'ai fait ce qu'il fallait faire. You know, this was very much the kind of thing that women in the resistance would say. And we do hear Josephine Baker in later life giving interviews saying this kind of thing.
I actually have a follow-up question that's a bit linked to that. I might just steal this one. And this brings me to think about her earlier life, because she has a hard start. I mean, she starts in the US, and I think she's, exploited as a young girl, very early age, physically, sexually, financially, and she travels a lot. Isn't that right? I mean, she's around the country, and she comes to France. I can't remember how she comes to France, but she's a risk taker in many ways, I think, from the start, and she has huge difficulties that she has to surmount just from as an early child. And so in a way, I don't know how you think that might match up with this, she's able to carry on, she's got broad shoulders.
Yeah, I think she's really tough. Yeah. She's really tough. I mean, there are stories about her early life that she was very ill-treated. She marries very young. She has 2 marriages in her teens. And she was lucky. I think she was lucky. She was picked up to appear in Paris by Dudley, who was the wife of the American ambassador, who was bringing a black bottom show, as it was known then, to Paris at the time of the Harlem Renaissance. And actually, music hall was running into a bit of trouble in Paris, and there was a keenness to try some more experiments, and she was part of that show, and she was at the end of the chorus line in the shows in New York, and attracted the attention because of her clowning around and being rather, being noticeable. She had this, and we see pictures of her, don't we, with cross-eyed pictures of her. Yeah, she sort of clowns, as you said earlier, and then she put on this extraordinary display that she was clearly put up to, but which absolutely fascinated Parisians, and it sort of was the stepping stone for her to become incredibly famous. But although she enjoyed the wealth and affluence, I think she surrounds herself with people who can help her, who can improve her. She learns to sing. She was virtually illiterate. She learns to speak and write French. And when you read her letters, both her English and her French are full of mistakes. I mean, she's not. But yeah, she was determined to improve herself. And she felt this huge debt that she had to France because she'd escaped segregation.
Great. I think we have. We've also got two questions here. They've been holding their hands up for a long time. So we'll have 1, 2, and 3, and maybe we can take the questions all in one go, and then Hannah, you can answer them, if that's okay. If you would like to go first, since you have the mic, and then we can bring the mic back around.
Mic, yes. Hello. Thank you. I don't know anything much about apart from the show bit, but I was thinking about her being a spy, and that she was obviously overlooked. The Germans didn't pick up on it, and I was thinking, is it because she's black that she's underestimated completely? And if it had been a white woman, certainly not a man, I think, but if it had been would she have been found out? Would there? She marries a Jewish person, a man. It's visible from your description, and yet she's overlooked. And I'm thinking, completely underestimated because she's black.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. If you can pass the mic back here. Yeah, and then we'll bring it. We've got, yeah, 2 questions there, Jane and Sophie. Yeah.
Thanks, Hanna, for a wonderful talk. My question was about whether you found any, I don't know, tangible signs or evidence of her influence on the Franco-American relations in the early post-war period, or not.
Brilliant. And then I think we had another question up right there. If you can send the mic up. Brilliant.
Thank you. I'm super excited to read this book. It just sounds wonderful. You mentioned the OSS, and I wondered if you'd had the opportunity to look at Bletchley recordings, transcripts, or SOE, and if she was ever referenced by the British intelligence.
Okay, I'll start with the last. Let me start with the last one and say, no, I haven't been to Bletchley. I did spend a lot of time in the National Archives looking at all the SOE material from Morocco, and I found nothing. But I did find a reference to Josephine Baker in Donald Darling's memoirs. He was stationed in Gibraltar, and he does mention Josephine Baker, and he does say, we all knew she was France's Gaullist intelligence agent. So it's clear to me that the British intelligence knew that she was working as an intelligence agent, but I didn't get more than that, unfortunately. I mean, goodness, I did try. Franco-American relations. Sadly, Josephine Baker, she longed to be successful in America, but she just, the Americans didn't really rate her. I mean, it wasn't until 1951 when she'd started to make some serious pronouncements in favor of civil rights and so on, that the I'm tired now, NACCP, that she became celebrated as a civil rights activist. But it was always something she did in her own way. She sort of had a very personalized approach to it. And she would give lectures and talks. She knew how to work a room, but she would talk about her experience of coming to France and how very different it was from America. So she really struggled to gain acceptance as a performer in America. And I don't think that her activism during the war helped really Franco-American relations in the way you suggest. In fact, I did find that the French consul in New York, I found some documents in Nantes, and they were really quite worried about Josephine Baker. They were quite worried that she was going to say things that might upset the Americans and put France in quite a bad sort of, what's she going to say about America? She's attacking America. Where is that going to leave us? So actually, I think there was quite an opposite problem, really. And was she overlooked because she was black? She was overlooked in intelligence. I mean, I think she was hiding in plain sight. She was overlooked as a celebrity. I mean, to be fair, the French intelligence services had used celebrities. They understood that celebrities had this, they could move around. They sent, there was another performer a female performer who, Payol, the head of the counterintelligence, talks about sending to Goering, and she would report back. And they didn't fall under suspicion. So I think her blackness and her celebrity and her personality all combined to create this huge cloak of that prevented her from being suspected. And I think it's even the more remarkable because Abte was suspected. But it was very clear that she was seen as set apart from him, even though they were together a good deal of the time and he was her handler. And they still didn't see her.
We're almost going to bring this to a close with just a final little question that because I think Colin had a second point to his question about the relationship with France and the question of race in France. And I do, in many ways, do you think she's glorifying French universalism because of the extent of American racism in the interwar period, which is very different to, you know, the racism that's existing in France at the time, and that clouds her ability to see the threat of the question of race in France? Or do you think that she does, you know, because you mentioned she responds to some, she's deeply hurt by some of the racist comments, but at the same time seems to be saying that France is this haven in which she can thrive as an African-American woman. So yeah, I was wondering if we could finish on that before allowing you to have a drink and relax.
Yeah, I think there is a paradox there. And I think that Josephine Baker was extremely careful. I think she understood the deal. She understood, and it's very interesting. I read all the intelligence reports of the conferences. She joins the anti-racist groups in France in the 50s, and she does a huge launch event in the Chateau des Milandes, and she gives talks right across the country, and the French intelligence services are there, and they're very worried about what she's going to say, and she's very guarded about what she says about France. She deflects all the time. She talks about America, she talks about the wonderful experiences she's had in France, and I think she does very deliberately understand that if she is to survive as a celebrity in France, her role is not to be critical of decolonization. Her role is to look the other way. She wants the public to support her project at the Chateau des Milandes. She's not in a position to start making statements of critique about what's happening in Algeria and Morocco, and she doesn't. And she is attacked for that. I mean, many of the civil rights activists in America do take her up. They say, you know, she's very critical of what's going on in America, but why doesn't she look at what's going on a bit closer to home? So there is that paradox there, and I think it is a very important and very key one to highlight.
Well, on that note, I'd like for you to join me in thanking Hanna for this wonderful introduction of her book, of Josephine Baker. So thank you so much, Hanna. Everyone is welcome to join us afterwards if you go past those doors at the back, you'll see drinks, some canapes, a place where you can hang up your coat. So you're welcome to join us to relax a little bit afterwards. And again, a huge congratulations to Hanna Diamond. Thank you so much.